Hello, I'm Chuck Geschke, your guest host of the Los Altos History Show. Our guests tonight are Mel Kahn and Frank White. Welcome, Mel and Frank. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks.
Mel is a second-generation Los Altan. His father, Sam, or Sammy as everyone called him, and his wife, Annette, settled here in Los Altos in the 50s and opened Kahn's Pharmacy. Mel, why don't you tell us a little bit about that pharmacy? I know you're still running it and how your family got it started.
Well, actually, my dad came in, I believe it was 39, and he had been born and raised, in fact, he always talked about being born and raised in San Francisco, so coming to Los Altos in those days was really coming from the country, from the city to the country. And actually, at the very beginning, I don't think he enjoyed it very much, but my mother was quite determined felt that it was time for him to own his own business, and he was working at a very fancy pharmacy in San Francisco called Ladd's Chemist that was in the St. Francis Hotel right at Union Square. The Fleischackers, all the very wealthy, went to this pharmacy, and he even tells the story of selling $100 hairbrushes. So you can imagine if in the 30s, if you're selling a $100 hairbrush, I don't know what that would relate to today, but it would be very expensive. So the contrast of being in San Francisco and coming into this small community was somewhat overwhelming. And this was a very small community, and he used to comment that people would be upset if he even moved the newspaper rack from here to there and ask, why did you do that, you know? So.
Right, I can imagine that was quite a change.
Yeah.
Frank, I understand that you were a podiatrist here in the community of Los Altos for some time, but you sort of cut your teeth in the medical business by working at Kahn's Pharmacy for Mel's father, Sammy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how that began?
Well, I noticed that there was an ice cream parlor in town. I was about 14 at the time. Always wanted to work in a soda fountain and a drugstore, as every young man at that age may or may not want to do. But I applied for the job. I was 15, and the day I applied is the day they took out the soda fountain. So then I was stuck working in the drugstore. And so I just worked for Sammy all the way through high school and part of college for about 5 years total. And it was a very rewarding experience. Sammy was just a real great man, very honest, very sincere, very charitable. And
he put up with you.
And he put up with me. And that was the main thrill. If he could put up with me, he had to be. He
had to be a real prince.
He had to be a real prince. But we had a great relationship, and I spent more time at the store working for Sammy than I did at home, because we worked 7 days a week, and if I wasn't in school, I was at Sammy's working. But it was a great experience. I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Now, in those days, the community of Los Altos was already beginning to change. Certainly in the 50s, there were still a lot of orchards, a lot of agriculture going on in this area, but you were sort of beginning to experience the change from a very rural kind of agrarian environment into something that became much more populated. How did that influence the store and how your families related to the community?
Well, actually, it all seemed to happen rather slowly, and I look back and realized that it was country, but I didn't think of it as country. But I used to date, I remember I used to date someone that lived off of Fallen Leaf Lane. It took a long time to get out to Fallen Leaf Lane. That's just the other part of Los Altos, but you had to go down Fremont. It was 2 lanes. You'd get stopped at stoplights. It would be 20 minutes or 25 minutes to get out there. It was just a real country place, and sometimes if we get out into out into the valley or up in the wine country, and we'll be driving along, and I would tell my family, I said, this is what Los Altos used to look like. But it did happen quickly, but it just progressed, and it seemed like before I knew it had done that. Do you feel that way? Or?
Oh yeah, it was slow, but at the same time progressive all the way. Mm-hmm.
Right. How did your father go about finding a pharmacy to buy here in town?
Well, actually, I think that he was by far the big salesperson, the head pharmacist, and had done all the stuff for this Ladd's Chemist. And I remember him telling me the story that he got, as a Christmas bonus, he got some silk pajamas this one year, and he threw them across the room and said, I need to be doing something more than, I'm generating all this, and it's time for me to do something on my own. And my mother wanted him to do that, and because she would say she used to observe that everyone would come and ask, they say, well, ask Sam. So they looked around, and I think actually they looked in Mountain View, they looked in Los Altos, I think there was a pharmacy in Sunnyvale, and I'm not sure, I think the deal was very good in Los Altos. I know that I've always thanked my lucky stars that that's the community that they settled in, because I feel that luckily we turned out to really have a lot of staying power in this community, and it became the way, we feel very privileged to be in Los Altos. And I think probably at the time it was not Jack Shoup. Which Shoup was it?
This Paul or Guy?
It was Paul Shoup.
Paul Shoup, yeah.
That had the business. He wasn't a pharmacist. He had a pharmacist that left him. There was some lady that was there that was a part-time pharmacist that evidently wasn't real swift. So he was anxious to sell the business, and he did own the building. But so I think the deal was advantageous for my father, and my mother she liked this community also.
In fact, I think you mentioned to me earlier that at first your dad wasn't so certain he really liked Los Altos and moving down there.
He would be the first one to admit, if it wasn't for my mother, I have a feeling they never would have stayed here. He could actually look out the window. That pharmacy was at First and Main, where the Mandarin Chinese restaurant is today. And the train station was right across the street, and the train would come and go, and he would just be wiping that counter looking like, I want to go back up to San Francisco. And actually, he was the big city boy, a newcomer, and I'm not sure he was particularly welcome with open arms initially. But I think it was a year and a half later, they began to feel very much a part of the community, and maybe the community realized they were going to be here for a long time. And from then on, my gosh, he always was talking how wonderful Los Altos is.
Well, maybe he was conditioned by some of the great young help that he hired, Frank.
Not hardly, no. I was
he stayed in spite of that.
He stayed in spite of me, right. No, I came on the scene a little bit later. I came on the scene in about 1950, and I left about 55. But it was a great city. And do
you remember some of the stores that were around town in those days?
Well, we had the post office right across the street, First and Main. We had J&S vegetable stand down the street. We had Mac's Tea Room. We had a sports store, Scary's sports store. And then, of course, the movie theater came in about 52. And I was lucky enough to get the job after working for Sammy. When I would leave that at nighttime, I'd go down and change the marquees. And Mel would always tease me, and sometimes he was right. I misspelled a few things. Misspelled a few words. But we changed the names of the movies so well that it escaped a lot of people. And so instead of saying, well, did you see Go for Broke with Van Johnson, they'd say, have you seen that Go for Roke? And it would stay. And so everybody in town thought it was Go for Roke until they read the paper. And but it was an interesting time. There was a real estate office right behind Kahn's Pharmacy that Mr. Peters, who was very well known in town in real estate, had.
And he always wore his suit with a vest and a jacket. It could be 95 degrees out, and old Mr. Peters would come walking down the street.
Always dressed to the nines.
Always dressed. Well, no, he would hang his coat on his shoulder, didn't he?
He'd have his finger on the loop of the coat, and he'd have it over his shoulder. And you could always tell him in the crowd, because he'd be the only one that would have his coat over there, and that was his standard.
I remember that as a little kid. He was really an amazing man.
Now, I understand that during the war years, your parents got involved in a project where I think your mother, who I believe might have been a nurse by training, began to set up a sort of field hospital here in Los Altos for the citizens. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
In fact, I wasn't born in Los Altos. We lived in Los Altos, but my mother didn't trust any of the hospitals around here. She had been a nurse at the French hospital. I will say that my brother was born 4 years later and they went to Palo Alto. I know it was a big inconvenience, but I was born in San Francisco. And then when the war years came, she had just been out of nursing for a short period of time, and she set up with it. Red Cross didn't want to service Los Altos. There weren't enough people here. So she set up, I believe there were about 12 beds. They did it in the church over on University, which I don't know that it's there anymore. And my father was involved. In fact, in the war years, the pharmacist, in a way, became the physician, and a lot of the laws and the rules were kind of bent somewhat because there were no physicians left in Los Altos. There were none in Mountain View. I think you had to go to San Jose or Palo Alto. There was just hardly anyone here. So they did spend a lot of time on that. And that was, my father helped, but I think my mother was the real backbone of that project.
Oh, that's neat. Frank, you told me that you went to work for Sam in 1950 when you were in high school. Can you tell me a little bit about the business and sort of how your experience there evolved while you worked at the pharmacy and how you observed it grow as a business?
Well, the pharmacy was unique in that it had everything in there from ping pong balls to $35 wallets in 1950, which was unheard of. But Sammy encompassed everything in the shop, and as Mel said, he was a great salesperson, but he was always honest, fair, and if somebody didn't like something, bring it back, and he'd always make it well. And we had the train was the big thing. The train would come in right where Foothill Expressway is, and the train would pull right into town, about 2 or 3 trains a day, and the most favorable time was the 6 o'clock train that would pull in from San Francisco, and Sammy approximate store to come to, because as soon as you got off the train, you walked 1 block and you're right there at the First and Main. And they'd always come in and get their supplies, including liquor, because Sammy kept a big contingency of liquor, and it was
for medicinal purposes.
For medicinal
I'm
purposes.
Sure.
And so the first thing that I would do when I got off school and hit there would be to fill all the liquor empties and make sure that it was stocked full. That was important.
I did that too.
And oh yeah, and then the people would come in and just any supplies they needed, and all of a sudden the store may only have 1 or 2 people in, and you look up and you knew the train was in because there was no room in the store. Everybody was busy, many people in the store at one time. So it was a unique time, and it was just a great place to grow up in, and everybody was looking out for everybody, and everybody knew who was on first and who was on second.
Well, and pharmacy in those days carried everything. You know, all our businesses have changed drastically since then. But I mean, really, when you think back, I mean, it was almost anything. If somebody asked for something, you try to figure out how to get it in the store. So the variety was, and it was just up to the walls. And in the back, remember there was that huge back room?
Oh yes.
You'd go in and because that was also the days where you'd buy. I remember we still joke about where they call 11 and 1 free. I mean, your inventories were much heavier than they have been for years. Really. It was just a different time.
Different environment. Well, there have been a lot of interesting, famous, well-known people who have lived in town. Can you share with us some of the well-known folks who might have dropped by from time to time that you got to know, or interesting characters?
Oh yes,
one form or another. I'm sure there were several.
There were several. There was Frank Ainsworth, who was the town. A very interesting person. He lived up in Los Altos Hills.
He was an attorney.
He was an attorney. His father was in the history books as a naval officer in some famous battles of previous years. And Frank was very well known in Los Altos. And I had to drive Frank home a few times as a young man. And
so he had been a good customer.
He had been a good customer, and Sammy would sort of guard him and hurt him a little bit. And
we'd have to be real careful when he came in on what he might say. With ladies around, because it didn't. There were no holes barred with Frank.
Then you would go to the other end, the very sophisticated, which Frank was too at times. But Earl Dawson and
he had been a vice president of General Motors, and had bought a home on the top of the hill. In fact, I remember delivering to him, and he was behind this huge desk, and you'd go walking way down into his office. And he was really a nice man, but it was somewhat intimidating for a little
you're
kid.
a young kid.
And
Going
all of a
in.
sudden you see this huge room with all the leather, and it was dark, and he's behind this huge desk. And he was always very friendly, but if you didn't handle it exactly right, you heard about it immediately, didn't you? He was used to having his way.
Yes, yeah.
Nice man.
And we had, like Mel said, Guy Schaupin and Paul Schaupin. They were very noted people. And we had several judges in the area, and there was Judge Bowen that was for years. And there was a couple other noted figures. There was Mr. Quinn, who had Quinn Hill. He had the whole hill there, and he was very notable. And
You're not going to tell all those
no,
stories.
we won't tell all the stories, but it was quite interesting.
Doing a little bit of editing here on the fly, I can tell.
Yeah.
I'm sure as a main business in town, you had a lot of those interesting stories. I also understand that the pharmacy had a soda fountain, but it perhaps was not the feature in the store that your father appreciated the most.
Yeah, I think
Maybe that's with an understatement even.
Yeah, when he bought the store, the soda fountain was there, and I think he felt it was very demeaning that for him, who had been this hotshot pharmacist in San Francisco, to be making sandwiches, and because he would have to do it sometimes, and it was fairly popular. I mean, there was fairly busy, but you didn't make very much money at it, and I think it was 50 cents for a sandwich and a milkshake.
Oh, wow.
And my mother used to love to tell the story, and would just laugh when she'd tell this story about. Because she worked there for the first few years all the time, I believe. In fact, I know she did. And she worked a lot in the fountain, and this one day, this gentleman was complaining about the funny taste of the milkshake she made, and when she looked back, she saw that she'd put soap in it instead of the vanilla or whatever she was supposed to put in, and she just got hysterical. The guy never found out. She just made him another. But I'll bet I heard that story 20 times. With a lot of laughs. So he was happy when he had the opportunity. He really needed that room for merchandise, felt he would do better as a businessman to do that. And in fact, I remember the day that the guy that bought the long marble, remember it was a long marble thing, and that was the guy that had the restaurant down on 2nd Street. And as he was pulling it out, and my dad was all nervous about that, they dropped it and the whole thing broke. And he'd already paid my dad for it, but it really hurt anyway. He thought it was really special. He used to talk about that imported marble.
Right. Well, now, obviously, the pharmacy is not up at that corner anymore. So when did the business move, and why did you decide to move it?
Well, he moved in about, I think it was around 54, 55. And actually, he had bought 2 pieces of property. In fact, actually, there was a number of properties, but he bought one on 3rd and he brought one down further on 1st, because at the time he said he didn't know which way the town was going to grow, whether it was going to go down 1st or was it going to go down Main Street, because they weren't too sure.
Right.
And it became apparent that it looked like Main Street would be the way it would go. In fact, he had that property for quite a while, and he let the Chamber of Commerce, they had their building at 3rd and Main for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I think, for quite a while. They built a little building, and that's where the chamber was. And so he also wasn't able to buy the building at 1st and Main, and I think he wanted to be his own landlord. And that was somewhat, also he needed more room and a more up-to-date pharmacy. In fact, I remember with the liquor, because I was the boy at that time, and one of my jobs was to do the liquor, and you could drop a bottle up at 1st and Main, and the floor was so creaky that it would just fall, and it would kind of go like this, and nothing would happen. All of a sudden, I broke 3 bottles the first week, because they just fall over on this new floor, and yet a cement floor, you really had to be careful.
So the cost of doing business started to go
Well,
up.
I had to correct that real quickly. That wouldn't last very long.
Well, I know your dad was very involved in a number of things, and in 1979 he won the Los Altos Realtor Award for community service. And I think we have a picture of him, actually, that we're going to be showing people while we talk about this part. But with some of the organizations that he was associated with, we'd like to hear a little bit more about them.
Well, I think the Village Association, he was one of the founding members, and that really came about when they set up the parking plaza and they had the assessment district, and after they did that, they formed their village association. He was always very active in whatever happened downtown. He was, probably his greatest love was the Los Altos Rotary Club, and he wasn't a charter member. I think he missed 1 year, but he certainly was the longest continuous member and had a real strong love for that. He was the song leader for probably 40 years, once a week, and even in the days when he couldn't do too much else, he would make sure that somehow he got to Rotary and would try to lead the songs.
In fact, I think you shared with us that he won a very prestigious award from the Rotary.
Well, they honored him by making him a Paul Harris Fellow, and in those days, the clubs didn't usually do that. Now you can do that individually. In fact, it was very nice that the club members put on a special program for him when he could realize what was going on. I thought it was very nice that they did that, and they devoted a whole day to kind of his life in Rotary and thanking him for what he had done. And I've always felt it was very nice to do that while someone has their senses together and can appreciate that.
Can really appreciate the award.
Mm-hmm.
I also know your mother, Annette, was a community presence in her own right. What were the kind of things that she was involved in
Well,
Los
she was the
Altos?
president of Federated Women's Club, and I'm not sure what year, I think in the early 70s, and she was on their board a number of years before that and after, and I know they did a number of fundraisers. I think they did something for Foothill College. In fact, I know my father was involved in Father's Frolics, which was a real fun community. Did you ever go to Father's Frolics?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean that was a really fun occasion.
Was that organized here in town, or?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and they did that. In fact, that's how they got the money to put the pool at Covington School.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
And
that's
so they were always doing these type of community things. I kind of grew up. You just were expected to do this type of thing.
To be involved and be part of the community.
Right.
Now, both of you have been what I guess today we call the healthcare industry. They probably didn't use that term back in certainly the 40s and 50s, but I'd be a little interested in you sharing with the audience here your perceptions of what's changed as in the field like podiatry or medicine in general and the pharmaceutical business.
Do we have a couple hours to do this?
Well, we could certainly lengthen the show if you'd like. But.
Well, it's I mean, as far as pharmacy and healthcare, I was involved in not only retail pharmacy, but I was involved in home IV and servicing skilled nursing facilities and nursing and all types of part of healthcare. And it's became very apparent a number of years ago. It's almost like what you see today with these bank mergers. Well, everything keeps getting bigger and bigger, and my company, when I was involved with it, we covered most of Northern California. Then insurance companies and HMOs are saying, well, can't you go to Southern California? And for the small, we were pretty good size, but not very good size of what was going to occur nationally. And I think insurance companies have changed healthcare dramatically. Not totally sure it's for the better.
You seem to be choosing your words very carefully
well,
on that.
I see some things. I think some things needed to be done. I think I see the pendulum maybe swinging back a little bit. I don't think the public was quite aware of how deep some of the cuts were and what they would cause. And I think we're starting to see that now, and we need a balance somewhere there. I don't know. I didn't mean to.
Not at all. I think just from a podiatry specialty within the medical field, we've seen severe cuts in reimbursements and what you can do, what you can't do. But more than that, I think the HMO and the PPOs and all these healthcare organizations are seeing that their subscribers are really questioning their authority to rule their medical care life. And point in question, I was talking to an orthopedist friend of mine the other day, and he had a patient that had phlebitis, which is inflammation of the veins of the legs, and it's life-threatening. And so he wanted to put the patient into the hospital and do a invasive non-invasive procedure to a point where you can at least get into see how the veins are doing. Then it becomes invasive. So it's called an arteriogram, just to examine how the arteries are going. So he put a call in for an okay for this, and it took 6 hours, and then he wasn't getting it, so he just had to do it because it's life-threatening. He got a call from the HMO, and the person that okays this is not a doctor. And the first question the person says is, what is an arteriogram? Was asking the doctor, what is an arteriogram? And here this subscriber is paying money to join this health maintenance organization. Not trying to slam all health maintenance organizations, but you take that one case in point, it can narrow down exactly what is really happening in the healthcare industry.
You know, I just might say that our pharmacy changed its focus. In fact, I should give some, my wife is very much involved in the front end of the store and does gift buying. In fact, some of my friends would call it Matey's Boutique rather than Con's Pharmacy probably right now. And we've gotten very involved in compounding specialized medications, diabetic, other areas, because you need to do that in order to survive.
Sure.
Which I think all businesses are having to do that. You need to see where there's a chance to survive. I guess what concerns me is how far it will go, and it does seem like the insurance companies and the HMOs every year, they, instead of giving you a little increase, they try to decrease a little bit. But
well, I think the fact that you both could share the perspective of having, in effect, run your businesses here in our community and have watched the transition over the many years of the history of healthcare and of servicing the community that's a real treat for our audience to be able to hear that, particularly from folks like yourself that are so involved in the community. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Los Altos History Show for spending the time this evening to share with us all that you have done on what Los Altos was like and what the involvement of the Con family was with the pharmacy, and one of their star employees from back in the late 40s and early 50s. And
yeah, he is a lot older than me, you realize.
Well, we weren't going to bring that
Okay,
up, but now
all
that
right.
you've mentioned it, I guess it's on record, so we'll have to live with that. Well, thank you again, Frank and Mel, for joining us this evening. We certainly enjoyed having you as our guests. And thanks to all of you, our viewers, too, for joining us this evening on the Los Altos History Show. And we look forward to seeing you next time.